So, Guilty Gear Strive has been out for about 4 years now, and over the course of those 4 years, we've gotten a bunch of additional DLC characters. Seriously, they've added so many characters to this game, it's actually kind of crazy to look back on. Across all these different characters, we have a wide variety of playstyles as well. You have more basic, straightforward characters like Sin or Elfeld, as well as more complex weirdo characters like Jacko or Bedman. However, despite all of these different characters and how differently they might all play from each other, there is one recurring trend with these characters that players have noticed over the years. That trend being, these characters tend to release relatively weak compared to the rest of the cast. Very frequently, upon a new character's release, players quickly recognize that new character just doesn't stack up compared to the rest of the cast and ends up at the bottom of the tier list. And yes, of course, there are some exceptions to this. It's happened commonly enough that there is honestly this sense of dread in the community before a new character drops, where players are worried we're going to get yet another dud of a character, at least competitively speaking. This can even really dampen the excitement around a new character too, because they just end up spending less time in the spotlight as players deem them not worth playing so quickly. And while you could argue this short window of exploration is part of the cause for these characters being considered weak, I don't think that is the case, at least entirely. This does beg the question, however, why does this happen so frequently? More importantly, and one of the main questions I want to focus on for this video, why is it that two completely different characters, released in completely different betas and at completely different time periods, end up having the same fate? Seriously, let's use Biken and Dizzy as examples. Both characters play completely different from each other, released in completely different versions of the game, and released several years apart. And yet, both of them released relatively weak. Of course, characters can be weak for different reasons, which is true here as well in some regards, but I think there's actually a lot more in common with all of these weak DLC releases than you might initially expect. And that is what I want to discuss today. And I promise the conclusion is deeper than you might expect. I think the best way to get to the bottom of this is if we actually take a look at the currently releasing Season 4 characters. As of right now, we have access to Dizzy, Venom, and most recently, Unika. Because Unika is the most recent character, opinions of her are still developing, so I'll talk about her separately later. For now, I want to focus on Dizzy and Venom because, oh boy, are they the spitting definition of what we just described. Both characters, almost immediately upon their release, found themselves near the very bottom of the tier list. It didn't even take players long to consider these characters bad and never look back, simply thinking it's better to just wait for a patch to buff them rather than waste their time on them right now. While I do think it's accurate these characters are relatively weak, I have noticed that there seems to be a general lack of understanding on why they're weak. I asked over on my Twitter why players think Dizzy and Venom are weak, and I actually got a lot of different replies with different reasonings, with some of which not even being accurate reasons for why the characters are weak. It's actually part of the reason why I decided to make this video in the first place. I think in the fighting game community, it's easy for players to just go with the flow on common opinions of a character and not think much beyond the surface. Similarly, I think it's easy for players to just give opinions on things, but not really articulate well why they think one way or another. They might understand intuitively that a character is weak, but not grasp why they're weak. I think this general lack of information is actually kind of bad. It leads to not properly understanding characters and what they do, making the scene overall weaker, but it also makes communication and discussion around balance suggestions less accurate. I think fighting games, and Strive specifically, have had a history of players frequently complaining about the wrong things for a character, either something being too strong or too weak, and is somewhat responsible for the things getting changed that probably shouldn't have changed. Obviously, Arceus does crazy stuff no matter what we do, but I think it matters at least a little bit. Anyways, to get to the bottom of it, let's start talking about Dizzy. To get started talking about Dizzy, I want to first talk about one common misconception I hear about why she's not good. One thing I hear from players that honestly kind of blows my mind is I see people say that she doesn't do very much damage. And I don't think this is actually accurate, at least for the most part. And if anything, I think it's one of her only strengths is that she actually does pretty meaningful damage. There are a number of hits that Dizzy gets that actually have pretty high return, including some hits that you wouldn't expect to have high return for her character archetype. Dizzy is supposed to be a mid to long range space control character, kind of like a zoner, and most of her toolkit is naturally designed to help her do so. Let's just take for example her 2D. This is a pretty long reaching, low hitting attack, and it's admittedly a pretty strong normal. On counter hit, it's actually quite rewarding for what type of move it is because it combos into Ice Spike. And in general, I would say most conversions that go into Ice Spike are relatively rewarding, because in general, I think Ice Spike is a good conversion tool. And I just want to take this moment to mention that I think most of Dizzy's unique tools are uniquely strong at what they're supposed to be doing. Ice Spike itself does have some problems, and we'll talk about those in a little bit. Now, another common opinion I hear about Dizzy, and one that is much more vague, is usually something along the lines of she's just not a very threatening character, therefore she's not strong. And while yes, it is accurate she's not a threatening character, it leaves a lot open to interpretation and doesn't really articulate why she's not threatening. Kind of going back to what I was saying earlier, where players can intuitively understand that while fighting the character, they don't feel very threatened, but they don't really articulate why that's the case. So let's talk about why Dizzy isn't threatening. So if I think Dizzy's unique tools are doing their job, but I also agree Dizzy isn't threatening, why is that the case? I think Dizzy's biggest weakness as a character, generally speaking, can be simplified as she lacks conventionally strong tools. So what do I mean by conventionally strong tools? Well, a big thing across the cast in Guilty Gear Strive is the ability to create offensive situations from neutral interactions, especially on block. There are a great number of characters in this game that can force offensive situations just from making you block something neutral. Let's take Elfal for example, who's not even considered a top tier character. Elfal has a number of normals and special moves that can force the opponent to interact with her on a neutral engagement. Something like far/2H puts the opponent in a situation where they have to guess on what special cancel the Elfal player might go for. She has access to her Rekka, which naturally the opponent doesn't want to block. She has Pineberry, which is another strong special cancel, and this is not even mentioning something like Wall Assault being great at forcing her offense. On top of that, she also just has strong tools for disengaging. She can always just cancel into her Fireball, for example, to push the opponent away and maintain safety. She gets to pick on what terms she interacts with the opponent, generally speaking. She can force interactions or disengage if she doesn't want to. Even if we're to go down the tier list and talk about a character more similar in archetype to Dizzy, we can talk about a character like Testament. Generally speaking, Testament's not considered that strong of a character, but they are a mid to long range character just like Dizzy. One thing that Testament does have over Dizzy in this regard is that they have Stain State. Because of the existence of Stain, it allows Testament to use their mid-range space control tools to eventually create offensive situations for themselves. Dizzy does not have this capability for the most part. She actually really struggles to create offensive situations from blocked moves in neutral. I mentioned previously that I think Dizzy has a lot of moves that are uniquely strong at what they're trying to do, but that's kind of the nice way of putting it, because in reality what that means is that her moves have very select, unique strengths, but it also means that she lacks utility, cohesion, and, as we were saying earlier, conventionally strong tools. Let's take Chestnut for example, which is her fire projectile. This move has a couple of unique traits, one of which being the fact that it erases other projectiles on startup. This is technically pretty good, but there's not that many characters that throw projectiles to begin with, and for the characters that do, it's not too terribly hard to play around this move, and it's not that rewarding, so you usually don't mind playing around it anyways. This move has good tracking to stop the opponent from just easily getting around it, and it also gives Dizzy a hard knockdown on hit. Both of these things are technically strong, but the move has so much startup, and Dizzy lacks other conventionally strong tools to prevent the opponent from just hitting her. And the character also lacks strong offensive ways to take advantage of these situations that Chestnut would be giving her. Chestnut itself is advantageous on block, which you would think would help with this offensive situation, but she has to be pretty much point blank to the opponent for this to matter, and if the opponent just uses FD, it's relatively effective at diffusing the advantage she would actually get from this move. Actually, on release, this move wasn't affected by FD, and it was insanely strong. It was actually one of the things that they nerfed in the emergency patch that they did, which I think was correct, but it's just kind of unfortunate that they didn't give her anything to make up for it, really. So what this means is that Dizzy has a lot of moves that are fulfilling very specific purposes, but none of her moves really accomplish some of the basic fundamental things that you want a character to be able to do in this game. More specifically, she's really lacking in the special cancel department. None of her moves really work as conventional frame trap tools, and none of her moves really allow her to establish offensive situations from neutral interactions, especially from block normals. Her only real frame trap special move would be Michael Sword, specifically the S version. This move on counter hit doesn't actually give her anything though, it just pushes the opponent away from her, which is fine for a zoner, but given the other problems I've already mentioned, it's not great, and generally you would rather get something meaningful like a combo or like a better knockdown or something. H Michael Sword does give her a great combo on counter hit, but it doesn't actually work as a frame trap most of the time because it's too slow. Both versions of Michael Sword also have the problem of being very weak to low profile moves, so characters can use their 6Ps, low profile 2Ks, or other low profile moves to deal with this. And because Dizzy just doesn't have another special cancel option, it's really hard for her to stop the opponent from using these moves. Dizzy has good normals, they just end up not actually mattering that much because her special cancels from them are very weak. Dizzy has special moves that have very specific, strong purposes, but they don't really have cohesion with each other, and none of them really allow her to mount a meaningful situation. I do think that she has some very strong conversions from very specific hits, but it's hard for her to get those hits in a way without taking a big risk on her part. And those hits are so specific, it's easy enough for the opponent to just kind of play around them. Because she lacks in utility, it means that it's easy enough to just identify the few things that she has that are good and just play around them. Dizzy also has one of the worst 6Ps in this entire game, which is a very important tool to have in this game. Obviously 6P is one of your go-to anti-airs, and hers is terrible. It's just very small both horizontally and vertically, and it's generally not very rewarding, and she can't do much off of it on block. Because of this problem as well, it means that she's weak defensively because her 2P and her 5P, which are already not great buttons, pretty much never go into anything, so she doesn't get a knockdown for mashing defensively. Because her 6P is bad, it means that she's also weak at dealing with mid-hitting attacks on defense or neutral. One strength of the character that I haven't really talked about yet is Ice Field, which is a follow-up to Ice Spike. Contrary to popular belief, I actually think that Ice Field is a really good move. It may be difficult for her to get Ice Field out in some matchups, but I think generally if she gets it out, it's pretty strong for her. The only real caveat to this is the fact that she's really bad at anti-airing, and Ice Field doesn't stop people from jumping. So if she's fighting a character that is even just good at jumping, it's really hard for her to properly take advantage of Ice Field. The last little detail that I want to mention with Dizzy actually has to do with a very important system mechanic. Right now in Strive, there is a problem with resource generation. Specifically, you get a lot of tension and burst gauge for getting hit in this game. This is something that a lot of the heavyweight top tiers take really strong advantage of, but in general, it's just kind of an issue that plagues the game currently, and has for a while. A very important detail about Ice Spike and the free state that it puts the opponent in is how this affects combo scaling. How much tension and burst you get actually has to do with the gravity scaling of the combo, and this free state that Dizzy puts her opponent in jacks up the gravity scaling. So while Dizzy does have some strong conversions from some meaningful situations, the fact that she builds her opponent so many resources for going for these conversions kind of diffuses how advantageous it truly is. Characters either just get burst to burst the combo that you got anyways, or they'll have so much tension and burst afterwards to just make a comeback on you. Ultimately, what this boils down to is that Dizzy's moves are too busy doing very specific purposes, and they don't end up having any cohesion with each other, and because she's just lacking strong fundamental tools, it's hard to take advantage of the specific uses they have, because there's nothing that really stops the opponent from just playing around them easily. There are a lot of little details that we could talk about with Dizzy, and if you guys would like to see like thorough character breakdowns like this, do let me know, because I would love to do more of that. But generally speaking, that's kind of the takeaway from talking about Dizzy. And you're going to want to keep all of that in mind while we talk about Venom. Now, much of what we said with Dizzy, I think also applies to Venom, which is further evidence of what I said earlier, that a lot of these DLC characters actually do have similar problems, albeit in their own unique ways. The conclusion is usually the same. So when it comes to Venom, he again has some uniquely specific strong tools. One thing I have never understood about this character that I hear people say is that his command grab isn't good. I think this is insane because in my opinion, his command grab is easily his best quality and is probably the reason why a lot of his other things are lacking. His command grab effectively lets him break the wall anywhere if you get hit by it. He can combo into a wall break pretty much off of any screen position. Because of this, his command grab effectively gives him positive bonus. Pretty much any other character in this game would love to have something like this. It is an insane trait to have. The problem with it is he just doesn't have a lot of things that complement having a command grab, and he doesn't have anything that really takes advantage of having positive bonus. I think something like getting a command grab into a wall break and then using Dark Angel for offense afterwards is supposed to be like the thing with this character, but ends up not really being something that you can do most of the time because of how much meter it takes. And even if it was the thing that he was supposed to do and it was good, it would be very one trick, so it would be relatively easy to play around. Another thing I see said about the character is that Dark Angel isn't very good, which I also disagree with that. He just doesn't have a lot of things that complement having Dark Angel, and he's not able to put himself in situations to use it very well. It's also said, much like Dizzy, that Venom doesn't do very much damage, which I think in his case is a little bit more accurate. A lot of this issue more so stems from inconsistencies with how his combos work, rather than just his numbers being low, if that makes sense. So fixing that problem is a lot easier than some people suggest. In that regard, I see people say that his command grab doesn't do enough damage, and I would honestly, personally, really hope that the command grab that gives him positive bonus anywhere on the screen didn't do very much damage. Maybe that's just me though. I think Venom also has some strong normals. I think his 5k, his 2k, bar slash, 2s, even 2d are all pretty good. So what is the problem with the character? Well, just like Dizzy, his 6b is pretty bad for pretty much all the same reasons as Dizzy. He once again has trouble creating meaningful situations from neutral interactions. The character actually has some pretty strong offense and conversions in very specific situations. It's just, again, hard for him to set those up most of the time. Specifically, if you block his moves in neutral, it's hard for him to either A, make you care about doing something after blocking his moves. He doesn't have great ways to reward himself for like frame trapping you or anything like that. And he's not really able to create an advantage from you blocking his moves. When it comes to using the balls in neutral, I believe this is supposed to be the answer to that problem, and they can be pretty obnoxious. He can send the balls a lot of different trajectories that can just be annoying to get past. But that's the problem, they're really just annoying. They rarely actually convert into a very meaningful situation, either on block or hit, and even just in getting the balls out or hitting them in a way that would be impactful can be very risky for Venom in the first place. I think Venom has a bit more of a cohesive game plan than Dizzy does, but it still ultimately really boils down to this problem that he's just lacking very strong conventional tools to complement any of the unique things that he's actually doing. So you ultimately end up not really caring about any of the unique and admittedly strong things that he would be doing, because there's just nothing to back them up. So now that we talked about Dizzy and Venom, I want to quickly talk about Unika, and as I mentioned, opinions of her are still developing, so I'm not going to go too in detail with her. But one thing is immediately obvious with this character, in that the general opinion of her is definitely higher than Dizzy and Venom. It remains to be seen where people put the character exactly, but she has much more clearly, obviously strong tools. The big difference with Unika in comparison to a character like Dizzy and Venom is that she, in this case, has very common, conventionally strong things. She herself does have some unique weaknesses. She's a pretty slow character, her K buttons are kind of questionable in terms of the special cancel options from them, and I would say personally that she doesn't have a lot of strengths, but she has very specifically, fundamentally sound strengths that are hard for the opponent to just avoid. If you block something like Unika's Far Slash or her 2S, you're going to have to deal with her special cancel options. It's easy for her to get a meaningful knockdown, it's easy for her to create frame traps that can be rewarding. Even the other problems that the character theoretically has, like being slow or having a bad 6B, because for some reason all the Season 4 characters had bad 6Bs, I don't really know why. But even for the issues that the character does have, she can still force these fundamentally sound situations that she does have. And that's a big difference with a character like Unika compared to most DLC characters that we get in this game. She may not be as unique or be doing as many things that are special to her, but she has a very basic and effective game plan, and she has most of the fundamental things that a character wants to have in this game. So what is the conclusion of all of this analysis? What is the takeaway we're supposed to have here? Well, obviously I can't go back in time and show you examples of how previous DLC characters were on release, but I can promise you a lot of DLC characters had a lot of similar issues to what we just discussed with Dizzy and Venom. These characters tend to struggle to create meaningful situations from neutral, or more specifically, struggle to convert from important interactions. These characters had unique, specific, strong tools of what they're supposed to do, but they end up not mattering very much because of either a lack of cohesion or a lack of fundamentally strong tools to help back them up. In general, these characters are just designed on a weaker power level where they have more inherent checks and balances to the things that they do. And honestly, this might be a bit of a hot take, but in my opinion, the problem with these characters is that they're actually kind of well designed. I know that sounds crazy, so let me explain. Usually in fighting games, the strong characters are strong because they have very powerful strengths and they don't really have weaknesses to what they're doing. Generally, strong characters just lack counterplay, or at least meaningful counterplay to their tools. On top of this, as a fighting game goes on in a constant quest of revitalizing the game and making it feel new and fresh, throughout various patches they continue to buff characters and give them new tools, and by the end of all these things, it usually ends up in the characters not really having their defined weaknesses anymore. That's pretty much the situation that we've hit with Strive at this point. Looking at Dizzy and Venom, they're actually generally more complete than previous DLC characters have been in the past, but because of the quote-unquote power creep that has happened throughout the game, they end up just not keeping up with the characters, even though they're technically stronger than DLC characters were in the past. I would say at this point, a lot of Strive characters fall under the category of not being well designed because a lot of them lack these proper downsides that they're supposed to have. Or they just end up having strengths that are so powerful, they kind of just make up for their downsides. I think this distinction is very important because something I think is unfortunate that has happened several times throughout this game's lifespan is people end up complaining about a newly released character, saying that they want this weakness removed, they want that weakness removed. And what ends up happening a lot of the time is we just make more characters that people are going to end up complaining about. Johnny on release wasn't considered particularly strong, and then he ends up getting very buffed in one patch, and he ends up becoming one of the most disliked characters in the game because he no longer has those built-in weaknesses that his character is supposed to have. Now, I'm not going to sit here and tell you these DLC characters are perfectly balanced, because clearly they're not. In a lot of cases, they do need buffs or they need some of their weaknesses removed. So I think it's very important when we're thinking about what should change about a character that we really ask ourselves these questions and what should actually change in the future. Now, as to why they keep releasing DLC characters that are weak, I actually think it kind of makes sense. I think Arceus generally is more concerned about just making characters unique and fun rather than balanced on release, and I think generally they err on the side of caution because it makes more sense to make a character too weak rather than too strong. If a character releases and they're too strong, it's probably very unhealthy for the scene and causes a lot of meta problems. Whereas a character is too weak on release, it doesn't necessarily hurt anybody and they can just kind of buff them in the future. But of course, those are just my thoughts on the matter. I know I have a lot of different perspectives on this situation, I have a lot of different opinions, so I'd like to know what you guys think down in the comments below. How do you guys feel about DLC characters and how they've been handled and maybe how they should be changed in the future? At this point, we have one last DLC character coming for Season 4, and that's Lucy. I'm very excited to try her out. She seems like she's going to have a pretty unique moveset, which, based on what we talked about in this video, that might not be a good thing for her, but we'll see. In any case, thank you all very much for watching, I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next one.